All right, so what is the Inflation Reduction Act? Does it pay for itself, and will it really help the environment? Well, let's find out. So the Inflation Reduction Bill, or the Inflation Reduction Act, was passed in August 16, 2022. They say H.R. 5376 is the largest environmental bill ever passed to date. So the IRA is a budget bill. It's the diluted Build Back Better bill that was resuscitated by Joe Manchin and Chuck Schumer, with some provisions to bring cinema along, mostly targeted at corporate tax incentives, to basically get it across the finish line. Now, being a budget bill, it was passed with the reconciliation provision, which meant that the Office of the Parliamentarian thought that the budgetary constraints were within certain guidelines that allowed it to be passed along party lines without a single Republican vote in either house. Now, as a budget bill, it's important to take stock in the numbers, the ins and outs, the dollars and cents. So let's start with that. First, let's look at the revenue side of the coin, or the money that will come in or the money that will be saved. How will the bill pay for itself? Basically, money will be saved in two general ways. One, through major tax changes, and through major healthcare changes through Medicare reform. Let's talk about the tax side of the coin first. Basically, there are three components to the tax changes. The first and most impactful is a 50% minimum tax on all corporations earning over $1 billion in revenue every year. Now, there are a few exceptions, again, based on Kristen Sinema's insistence that corporations that are subsidies of private equity firms, or for businesses that use accelerated depreciation accounting measures, which kind of pivots depreciation assets against revenue for tax reasons, if they're using that excess money for reinvestment. Basically, overall, this will still yield about $222 billion in extra revenue coming in to the federal government. Secondly, they're going to spend about $80 billion beefing up the IRS. This will allow them to go after people who just aren't paying enough taxes. They say that the $80 billion investment could yield about $124 billion in extra revenue, which is a 50% ROI. And I do find it kind of interesting that they already know what this figure is, meaning they know who's not paying their taxes. They just can't go after it today. And thirdly, there's going to be a 1% excise tax on stock buybacks. This will incentivize corporations to reinvest their money instead of buying back stock, which only affects shareholders. And they anticipate a $50 to $75 billion net revenue from this provision as well. So those are the tax-related things. Now let's look at the healthcare side. So the major piece of Medicare reform comes from allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices for the first time. This will allow Medicare to cap their expenses on 10 important medications in 2026 and 20 in 2029. Now, these are mostly older medications, at least 9 years old for traditional medications or 13 years old for biologics. Those are those fancy immune modulating drugs that you see commercials for all the time for rheumatoid arthritis, like Cosentyx. This video is not sponsored by Cosentyx. I wish it was. Anyway, back to the bill. Companies that refuse to negotiate with Medicare will be slapped with a 95% sales tax. And this bill will also cap out-of-pocket drug expenses for $2,000 for those in Medicare and cap insulin prices at $35 for Medicare patients as well. Now, commercial costs for insulin were not capped because Republicans refused to back it, even though they didn't vote for the bill anyway. Overall, with all these sources of revenue between the tax bucket and the healthcare bucket, that will yield about $676 billion to $737 billion in extra revenue over the next 10 years, let's say $700 billion on average. So now let's look at the investment side of the coin, or the costs. This is the money going out. Now, the lion's share is devoted to environmental regulations, tax incentives, and pollution controls. But there is $64 billion allocated to the expansion of access to the Affordable Care Act, which again is important to mention. But let's focus on the environmental side. Overall, this bill will spend about $369 billion in general on environmental related issues. And they're broken up into four general categories. Number one is corporate and individual tax incentives for green technologies and energy. There'll be changes to oil and gas production, changes to the use of public lands, and there'll be some other miscellaneous causes devoted towards environmental justice and specific actions like drought resilience programs, which they have about $4 billion allocated, which is really critical now given that the Colorado River Basin is basically drying up as we speak. Now let's talk about the business and consumer tax credits. So there'll be incentives for low carbon manufacturing, which will allocate about $10 billion specifically to update manufacturing plants and to produce electric vehicles. Credits for green energy specifically will include a $30 billion investment towards wind, nuclear, and biofuels, including hydrogen as well, and battery storage. Now there'll be $9 billion allocated for consumer home improvements like solar panels and wind. This will include the 30% tax credit on those investments extended up through 2032, which is a significant extension. Now, if you're interested in getting home solar, for example, I have a playlist here which can walk you through the process. There'll also be a new EV tax credit framework that maintains the $7,500 tax credit for new vehicles, but there are a lot of restrictions and the language is a little complicated, so we'll talk about that in another video. But there's also a $4,000 credit for used EVs as well, which is new. And there'll be a few million allocated towards companies to promote fair wages for steel and iron manufacturing, which is important to mention. Let's talk about changes to oil and gas production. So first, they will include a fee of $1,500 per offense for excess methane leakage, which is an important contributor to climate change and greenhouse gases. They will also expand the cost for leasing contracts for those looking for oil and gas rigs from $2 an acre up to $10 an acre. They will also expand the 45Q incentives for carbon capture technologies. This will change the reimbursement from $50 to $85 per ton of CO2 equivalent sequestered. And this provision is a little controversial because we actually know from the IPCC that carbon capture really isn't cost effective, but nonetheless, this was an important provision that some people think is kind of a bone to fossil fuels. And there are some other things that contribute to fossil fuel infrastructure as well, like the 60 billion acres in guaranteed land that will be allocated to oil and gas production every year, including areas in the Gulf of Mexico and Alaska. They will also reinstate at least 3 offshore oil and gas leases that were shut down previously due to environmental concerns. But they're also going to repeal a freeze on wind power from the Trump administration. Overall, these last few points are very Joe Manchin-y and definitely put in there as a way to bring him across the finish line and kind of allow some continued investment in fossil fuel infrastructure because his state of West Virginia is so dependent on it. There's a lot of important public land changes as well. Number one, $1.8 billion for fuel reduction projects on national forest land. There will also be $200 million allocated towards vegetation management projects, which will reduce forest fires and protect old growth trees. $2 billion in grants to fund tree planting, including local and tribal communities. $1 million in technical assistance for conservation projects through the National Resource Convention Service. They will expand the National Park Service staff with $500 million in salaries and $200 million in backlogged maintenance projects. They will also allocate $4 billion to the Bureau of Reclamation, specifically targeted for drought resilience in the Colorado River Basin, which I mentioned earlier, and $550 million for water supply infrastructure improvements, and $25 million specifically for canals, and $250 million broadly for conservation resource management from the National Park Service and the Bureau of Land Management. And lastly, there are a few other billions allocated for like pollution and environmental justice, including $27 billion for clean energy loans that will finance renewables transition in low-income communities, $3 billion for environmental justice block grants, and again, these are for communities specifically and disproportionately affected by climate change, $3 billion for air pollution monitoring, and an excise tax increase from 9.7 cents to 16.4 cents a barrel of imported petroleum and crude to fund disaster cleanup, and a permanent extension of the tax on coal production that funds the Black Lung Disability Trust Fund.
I think I'm getting the black lung, Bob. It's not very well ventilated down there.
For Christ's sake, Derek, you've been down there one day. Talk to me in 30 years.
Now, all this with the $64 billion that I mentioned to expand those enrolled in the Affordable Care Act through 2025 will bring a total cost of about $437 billion in total investments. So yes, if we look at the $700 billion in excess revenue versus $430 billion in costs, this will net approximately $300 billion in deficit reduction over the next 10 years. Now, with all the money and investments in these environmental programs, some estimates, like those from the Department of Energy, estimate about a 40% reduction in our CO2 equivalent emissions from 2005 baseline, which is significantly better than current estimates from our Paris Accord agreements, which will only yield about a 24% reduction with business as usual. Now, in another video, I'll dive a little bit deeper into how these provisions actually will work on a more specific level, and to see how close we are to a 50% net reduction in CO2, which is our goal and more in line with what the IPCC recommends as what the world needs to achieve if we're going to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. So overall, it's a really good start, and the bill does pay for itself and reduce the federal deficit by about $30 billion a year. even without including the extra costs for all the environmental and natural disasters that this bill doesn't account for. Now look, it's not perfect, it's not going to achieve all of our climate goals, but 40% reduction from 2005 is a really good start if that is to be achieved. So for more information, I'll link down to some resources below. Thanks for watching Saving Green. I'll see you in the next one.